So it's another episode of the podcast. Why join us on this journey? So just to tell everyone out there who has been listening to this, I mean to the feel of you in this vast universe, who finds that this podcast is not just a bother, but it's something that you would like to tune in. Our Facebook page is up. That's where we would like all of us together, where we can bring our conversations to something much more deeper than just a one-way street where I'm talking to you, but we can all converse with one another and perhaps help each other as we chart the path forward towards better worlds. And I love that word better worlds because we often live in time and space where the world as we know it is undergoing tremendous amounts of change, stress, and shiftings regarding so many kinds of perspectives and views. For instance, we live in a world where when we talk about work isn't just a 9 to 5 job anymore. Work is how can I stay ahead of the competition in terms of money making? How can I perhaps get connected to someone up there that can give me a pull up the ranks? So when we talk about this, then how is it for us? Do we actually pass on this message that work is but a game, a competition, a step forward, a kind of putting your best foot forward in order to impress? Or do we still hold on to traditional notions of work, where work is something that you grow in or cultivate within yourself for a long time, and you put that good out into the world in exchange for money? How does it work? Does it work, or is it both? How does this relate to one and to each other? And oftentimes we don't have the answers directly. We don't have a straightforward answer. We learn as we go, as we grow, and it is so much better when we have a community that can propel us towards greater curiosity, discovery. I'm trying to see how I can actually make this video stick, because there's actually a PowerPoint slide to it. Although on Spotify sometimes we don't show you the PowerPoint version. Yeah, so how we can grow and explore even more when we have people around us pushing us in towards that direction, who are not there to lord over us, or as in the past when we were perhaps growing up within more traditional authority institutions, where we felt we were suffocated, and where we felt that it's so limiting in terms of its views, or in terms of its way of just handing down to us what we should do or should not do. For instance, in religion, or certain types, certain kinds, and certain aspects of religion that tends to be top down, and we find that our own personal agency, our own personal voice gets trampled. Or perhaps we come from more traditional families, especially here in Asia, where as kids we don't grow our ability to actually critically think through issues and decisions, because those were made for us, and when we question them, we realize there's a wall that we come up against. And psychologists have said that if more often than not, when we find our voice not getting heard, then we develop defense mechanisms to avoid feeling that pain. And that means that we detach, that means that we ignore, that means that we start to repress those emotions, or we become anxiety driven, where we are just craving for just another person down the road to perhaps notice our efforts. And so we spend our whole entire seasons of our life, years in our life, to just work at getting someone's approval, and therefore at work we oftentimes do not actually tell the truth, perhaps when we see something has gone wrong, because we are so afraid that that would get us sidelined. And all of it, whether we become anxiety driven and we are desperate for approval, or we are people who just ignore and cut off connection between us and the world around us, the root is the trauma of growing up in spaces where we are not encouraged to explore, to be curious, to grow our own sense of personal agency. So how do we think through these things? And last week we left us all on that note of asking ourselves, what were those voices that shape us? And we said that some of them probably came from religion, like me. That's where I came from, a very religious kind of background. Or some of us our wisdom primarily came from our parents, and they shape a great deal of how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves, how we think about others. And oftentimes in the ultra traditional Asian home, the kid is left feeling that life is a competition, and that if we don't pull ourselves by our bootstraps and we don't charge forward along with the crowd, then we will get left behind in terms of finances, in terms of whether we'll be able to get married. And even when it comes to marriage, there's a whole ideological debate, there's a whole discussion about whether we should marry or we should not marry. In a world that's so fraught with chaos, should we give ourselves over to that commitment? Can we keep it? And even if we marry, do we want to have children, or do we want to just remain as a couple? And what's the purpose of marriage? Is there a point in this traditional institution? There's all these questions that we can ask, and oftentimes we ask them, and yet there is no help given by the people around us to actually think through these things. We are just told a lot of times, not explicitly but implicitly, to just move on down the road. So perhaps today you are moving on down the road, doing what society has placed on you, doing what your family has placed on you, doing what you yourself have told yourself that you were meant to do: get married, climb the ladder of competition. And yet all this while, you know you're not at a place where you would like to be. You know that perhaps that has squashed something in you that is so foundational to who you are. For example, the sense of wonder. You no longer look at things and go that, wow, there's so much possibility. Nowadays you look at things and it's just a black and white. It's just gray, but it's not even interesting. It doesn't invite you to question or to ask. When you were younger, you used to ask, how should we raise our kids? How should we date? How should we even pursue romance? What is romance? You used to ask and talk for hours about this, and yet the wonder is gone. And yet oftentimes the voices that shape us are very subtle, so we do not know them. We cannot recognize the source until we slow down and actually listen to what is shaping us. So I've often realized that our sources of knowledge comes from our immediate environment, and also perhaps the books that we read, the religion we grew up in, and that religion's affiliation, or that perhaps yours is not religion but your career, like the people that advised you and walked with you along the way, your mentors in the early stages, and their affiliation. What were they affiliated to? What kind of values did they bring in? Where did they learn those things? And I realized there's a tension between an Asian way of looking at the world and a Western way of looking at the world. A lot of, people might react that we are all humans, that whether Western or Asian, we are just trying to be happy with the life that we have, and that's true to some extent, but the way we actually look at life is so different. It's fundamentally different, and it expresses itself even through our language. As a teacher, I would realize that, as an English teacher, I would realize that English is causal driven, which means that it focuses a lot on causality, where something causes another thing to happen, where when A happens, it leads to B happening, and that is quite at the heart of the English language. But when you think about the Chinese language, a lot of times, I mean, I speak as a Chinese, but definitely in Asia, you have your diverse spread of languages, and you can start to think about what are those distinctives of the language. For the Chinese language, the distinctive is that we tend to describe the situation rather than explain the why. So we tend to just, it seems to be a loop where we actually tell what we see rather than actually pause to ask ourselves why we are seeing it that way. Perhaps the Chinese environment is one in which we find it irrelevant to actually get a certain cause when sometimes there's so much complexity, or we can't actually pinpoint one single cause that results in something. So we have kind of just given into the flow of things, which means that if it happens this way, then it just is. But is that always a healthy way of thinking? And of course, growing up, I am more informed by, as I said, Christianity. So Christianity came in some sense from Israel, and then it went all over to the West, and then now it comes in the last hundred years. I mean, last hundreds of years, it arrived and spread in Asia. But having gone through the West, therefore it carries with it a deep Western logic to it, which means from young I'm trained to ask myself, why is it this way? Or how did something happen? And how did it become what it is today? How did the thing evolve, or why did it evolve? What are the causes? What are the roots of it? And therefore I found myself oftentimes with things in society and with things that happen around me. For instance, we were talking just now about two very significant issues in our world today, which is work, how people see work and perceive work, and what is work. And the other thing we're talking about is marriage, how people see marriage, approach it, how they approach even the rearing of kids. And as you can see, my way of presenting these things is causally driven. It's driven by a cause, and then I'm trying to explain it. But perhaps for you explain the emotions of family, the importance of family in its meeting your felt needs, or your physical needs. Perhaps you're stuck there, and at how that thing actually makes you feel, and what is its use and value to you, perhaps. And I realized that in order to live a life that is balanced and flourishing, we need all these views. And yet oftentimes we find that living in Singapore or in Asia by and large, we tend to only stick with our tribes, or with certain cliques. Or sometimes we just go at it alone. And this can cause us to feel that we're just seeing things through our own lens. And that's why sometimes we are filled with so much insecurity at what is going on, because we have no one to bounce back and forth the ideas that we have, and whether these ideas need to be polished or modified or adapted, or whether they need to be chucked aside as irrelevant. We just don't have those partners who go into conversations with us about these things. Usually we we meet, and in 10 minutes we are expected to tell the other person whom we have not met for the last 10 years about the entire decade's worth of what has been going on in our life. And so we don't actually stop to ask ourselves and our listeners to actually ask us the questions about what has shaped us to be the person that we are, or what has shaped us to do certain decisions, or what has shaped us in our thinking, and to just hear us talk about the subject and ask us questions about it. We don't have that kind of connection, and therefore a lot of times we are poor in terms of emotions and in terms of ideas, and therefore we go on making decisions out of a lack rather than out of shared wisdom. And a lot of times I realize that in the Asian culture, and again in Singapore especially, we are invited to join institutions like churches, religions, self-help guru groups. We pay even for so-called psychics to tell us about what is going on in our life, where we need help, rather than find communities that are born out of that desire to bond with, to connect with each other, out of that pure desire not to earn or exact any profit, but just to journey, and not out of an agenda or even to have a God character, but just born out of the desire to journey alongside one another as human beings. And if you're a Christian out there, you may ask me, so do I still believe in there's a God? I'm not sure. There may or may not be, and oftentimes I am now more leaning towards the fact that there may not be a God out there, because I've gone through so much in life that has caused me so much pain. And it's not just the fact that I've gone through troubles and therefore I feel like my prayers will not be answered, I'm just walking away. No, this is a long story. And again, you have a long story too, about perhaps not about religion or God, but about something else. So the most desperate thing we need is actually to journey together. And if you think about this, that was the mandate of the church. The church in the first century world was a group of freedom fighters who could no longer accept the world as it is, which means we resigned to a world of violence, of a group lording over another group, of politicians corrupt, trying to oppress the weak. They could no longer submit to that kingdom. They longed for another kingdom, and they went as far and wide in the world to beckon others into this new way of living and being human under a different kind of system. They were freedom fighters, and they invited people. They were not trying to cut people off if people did not so-called believe that God exists, but they were encouraging people to consider that God does his creation based on a totally different order than what we see, which is the order of violence, greed, injustice, fear. That God has somehow come to cleanse these things. And he's helping us to join hands with as many people as we can find who want to be recreated and reshaped and remade into a very different kind of community, one that's fair, just, the one that's willing to walk with the weak. And that's why in the Bible, one of the greatest themes is that weakness is strength. When we are weak, then we are strong. Those who admit their helplessness, that they are ungodly, that they too disorder the world often. To unite hands with the poor, like it says in James. And even in the last part of James, it says that to actually pull those who are in the fire. And Jesus talked about the fire that consumes us when we are caught up in this system of dog eat dog world. This whole kiasu spirit of trying to get and exact from others, in which our whole society, I believe in Singapore, is kind of built, where our kids are tormented by this very spirit and we are giving ourselves to it. And the early Christians rebuke us for that kind of life. And they say that if that kind of life would be a life that will ultimately put to death innocent people, righteous people. So James was saying that like a branch from the fire, you would pluck someone out of that kind of system. That is salvation, that's love. And Paul says in Timothy to explain with gentleness those who oppose you, which means there are people who oppose this better way of life, this better way of being human. And even that, Paul says, journey with them. Journey with them. So the early Christians, there seems to be a call to be a different kind of community, one that would walk with male or female, Gentile or Jew, slave or free, barbarian or Scythian, just all kinds of people. And yet today we see religious institutions, even in Christianity, that portray a very different kind of me versus you, us versus them, which is not at the original heart of what Christianity was about, which was the word of freedom for a world that is so desperate to see justice prevail. Anyway, back to this. So, coming from that tradition, even though I came from a certain way of thinking about the world, and this cause and effect was driven to its extreme, where I had to simplify a lot of things. For instance, seeing people as less than if they were not Christians, or for example, as evil if they're not following the prescribed actions that I thought my holy book was telling me, or as it was being interpreted by the church. But I've come to see that if we are to flourish, we need each other in life-giving ways. We need each other in dialogue, in conversation. So, I encourage you to pause and to consider whether you will be helped by such a community, if it exists. A community that will lean into your story, to your highs, your lows, your pain points, your strengths, and will encourage you to ask the deep questions that you want to ask, and would step in and be that voice or voices of wisdom, where you can grow and flourish, and even when you are uncertain, to hold you up. So I long for that kind of community, and I hope that you will join us. And therefore we will probably talk through as well about the different perspectives between the West and here in Asia. How differently do we look at work, family, society at large, and therefore ourselves, because we are connected. Everything is connected to one another. How society is drives how we are, and how we act in turn drives society. And I hope that we can create a gathering where in the next few podcasts we will actually be inviting my friends, some of them who are interested in psychology, some of them are interested in more mystical expression of spirituality, some of them are more interested in literature, some of them are just educators, some of them are wives, and just to actually lean in on this conversation and what is life all about and how do we best support one another. So let me just leave you today with another homework. So we'll only podcast with homework because I'm a teacher, so that's just some assignment for you. I'd like you to consider how has your sense of right and wrong shifted over the years. What is something that was right to you when you were young but now seems wrong, or what was once disgusting and awful but now seems to be something that is an option for you to do? And why did that change happen? How did that change happen? Who encouraged you towards it? Perhaps what are your views towards anger, uncertainty, despair, selfishness, and survival? How has your views about it changed? Have you felt something was moral in the past but you no longer think so? But the more important question is why, and how has that affected you? So till next time, we'll talk about that. And remember, head down to our Facebook page in the link and connect with us. I'll see you there.